lot of traveling and a lot of public speaking, and I really, really, really love it. It's one of the aspects of the life of the mind that I enjoy the most. And one question that people might have is, well, is this a complement or a substitute for your research? Is it a complement to your research? Is it a substitute for your research? Is it a complement to your teaching? Is it a substitute for your teaching? So I want to say a few things about public speaking and how this interacts with the rest of my life as a scholar. I find public speaking to be an input into my teaching and an input into my research. It's an input into my teaching in a couple of different ways. First, it helps me think hard and clarify the main ideas that I'm dealing with. You know, when I have to, say, take complex ideas and compress them for an undergraduate audience or something like that, it gets me thinking in a slightly different way about some of the things that are on my mind in the classroom. And then the second way that it's an input into my teaching is primarily organizational. When I'm structuring a course, we can kind of flow from one thing, from one thing to another. And if I don't cover, I don't know, let's suppose I don't get to elasticity of supply or something in my general lecture on elasticity, that's great. We can cover it in the next class. I don't really have that option when I'm doing like a one-off 45-minute or 1-hour lecture before an audience that might never see me again. So I have to think hard about exactly what I want to say, the order in which I want to say it, and the overall logical structure of the 45-minute or 1-hour discussion that we're going to have. This helps me as a teacher, I think, because it helps me make my courses, it helps me make my lectures much tighter than they would otherwise be. Because when I start teaching some of my classes as if they're kind of like these discussions or kind of like these lectures, where I want to identify some key big ideas that I want students to take away. So I think it's a way of practicing public speaking, or it's a way of practicing communicating in front of a different set of audiences that I think ultimately makes me a better communicator in the classroom. I find that public speaking is also an input into my research. So one could say, well, you should be spending your time working on your research. Well, I think getting in front of an audience to give a general talk about economics, or even just a general sort of like layman level or undergraduate level talk about my research, is a great way to actually work on that research. First, by trying to condense big economic ideas into a lecture that I can give to an audience of people who are not specialists in my area, or who are not even specialists in economics, I have to think hard again about the basic ideas. People act, resources are scarce, people respond to incentives, stuff like that. And then, in thinking about my research area very specifically, I think about stuff in new ways when I'm trying to, say, for example, let's take the work that I do in Walmart and big box retail, where I've spoken before a number of audiences, of undergraduates and people in sort of general audiences. I've spoken to a lot of different groups about this. I have to think about that in a slightly different way when I'm preparing it for an audience of non-specialists rather than an audience of specialists. And indeed, there might be something fundamental that I might be missing because I'm just sort of like assuming that everyone knows what these very special technical terms mean, or have to think about those special technical terms in a slightly different way. And it really helps to clarify the logic of my arguments. In much the same way that public speaking helps me organize my teaching, it also helps me organize my research. Engaging in these kinds of public discussions, engaging in these kinds of public lectures, makes me again have to think hard about the logical flow of the argument. So in much the same way that I carried this into the classroom, I also carry it into my research. And indeed, some of my public lectures, some of the lectures I'm giving right now, are becoming working papers. They're becoming actual research projects, and they'll be circulating probably in various working paper series and things of that nature. So I'm able to actually turn the public speaking into research itself. Second thing to think about with public speaking is when you're visiting campus, you get to meet lots and lots and lots of interesting people who, even if you're on campus to give a public lecture about some general economic topic, or just some general topic within your field very, very broadly, one of the questions people are going to ask you is, well, what do you work on? And what do you teach? And you get to have this discussion, and they probably have a different perspective, or they probably have something to add or something to contribute that's going to improve your teaching, that's going to improve your performance as a researcher. Another thing to think about is for public speaking is to ask yourself kind of like, where are you going to be anyway? If you're going to visit family or something like that, are there colleges and universities nearby where you should, at the very least, try to establish relationships. Look for people who are doing things that you find interesting. Maybe not even in your own department, but invite them to coffee, invite them to lunch. Say, I see that you're working on this. I read one of your papers. You know, let's go hang out. Say, you know, I have a paper I would like to present, or even, you know, I have a lecture that I give in front of large audiences, or something like that. Can I give that lecture? I did this relatively recently. We were in New Orleans for a friend's wedding, and I have some friends at Loyola University, and I just sent them an email saying, hey, I'm going to be in town. Do you want me to speak? And lo and behold, we were able to work that out. It was great. It was an input into some of the other lectures I have given this week and that I'm giving next week. And it was, you know, all around a very positive experience. Once you're actually on campus for a public lecture or for a seminar or for something like that, the marginal cost of an extra event is probably going to be very, 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 very low. I take a lot of my inspiration on this from Deidre McCluskey, who she has a chapter called How to Host a Seminar Speaker in her book, How to Be Human, Though an Economist. And she talks about the kind of work that you should do, and the kind of work you should be expecting of people from a campus visit. So, for example, I might have like the big public lecture that I'm giving, but I might also say, hey, I can speak to a class about whatever topic, or I can speak to. So again, with the hat that I'm wearing for IHS, I can say, well, I can get people together for coffee, and we can talk about some of the opportunities that IHS has to offer. Something I did at Mercer University on Tuesday is, in addition to my big public lecture, and then in addition to the little IHS chat that we had, I said, well, look, I'd be interested in hosting a discussion with interested students about, say, what's the relationship between economics and a biblical worldview. So again, the marginal cost of things like this are relatively low. Now, granted, you probably don't want to be in front of an audience or in front of a camera or on from like the time you wake up until the time you go to bed, though that can be fun because it is a little bit exhausting. But nonetheless, you can find and identify these little pockets of time or these areas of mutual interest that you might have, where again, you can have discussions with people who will help you make connections, who will help, well, let me explore that for just a second, who will help you make connections with other people, who will help you make connections with other ideas, and who might help you make connections with perspectives that you might not even be familiar with, or connections with questions that you might not ask, otherwise that are still nonetheless going to be relevant to your research. Also, if you do public writing, or if you try to write for general audiences or something to that effect, speaking to different groups is that will very much be a complement to rather than a substitute for the public writing that you're doing. So for example, I write for Forbes.com and a number of other different places, and I draw some of my inspiration from lectures that I give in different places. It's a great way to kill 2, 3, 4, sometimes even 5 birds with one stone.